Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good afternoon. My name is Amy Draves, and I'm here to introduce Eric Klinenberg, who is joining us as part of the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Eric is here today to discuss his book, Going Solo: The Extraordinary Rise and Surprising Appeal of Living Alone. In 1950, Americans who lived alone made up only 9% of households. In 2011, this percentage has more than tripled. Contrary to the common assumption that living alone is lonely, those who live alone are socially active and civically engaged, often more so than their married counterparts. Eric Klinenberg is a professor of sociology at New York University. His research and stories have appeared in Rolling Stone, the New York Times Magazine, and on This American Life. He is also the author of Heat Wave and Fighting for Air. Today's cover article in Time magazine listed Going Solo as the first of 10 ideas that are changing your life. Please join me in giving him a very warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. It's really nice to be at Microsoft, and looking forward to the conversation today. I want to talk for about 40 minutes or so about the book, and I thought it would be nice to start by showing you the cover image. Obviously, I have a commercial, self-promotional motivation to do that at all times, but that's not the real reason that I have the cover up on the screen here. I want to call your attention to two things on the cover because it turns out it was a hard thing to come up with. The first is the title for the book, Going Solo. It took a long time to figure out that was the right title for the book. When the project started, the title for it was Alone in America. And if you think about it, that's a title that takes you emotionally to a very different place than Going Solo. We could talk more about where it takes you. But Alone in America and Going Solo are two really different ideas. Okay? And the next thing is I want you to look at the birds and the birdhouses, because they also take you to a place that's different than the icons and images that we had originally thought of putting on the cover, and I'm going to show you them in just a minute. So just for now, kind of take this in and think about these concepts. What I want to do over 40 minutes today is persuade you of two things. The first is this one, and I'm not going to read those words to you because I'm trusting that this is a literate crowd. And my number one pet peeve of going to a talk is when someone reads the slides. So this is the first idea that I want you to believe at the end of the 40 minutes that we spend together. The biggest social change. And the next is this one. Okay? It doesn't mean what we think it does. Now, if you think about the kind of icons that are readily available to someone who's going to write a book called Alone in America, this is one of the obvious ones that comes to mind, the kind of Lone Ranger cowboy figure. And it would have been an appropriate image 60 years ago, because it turns out that in 1950, living alone was most prevalent in the U.S. in the big open western states, places like Alaska and Nevada and Wyoming. People who lived alone were typically migrant working men. They were on the road to a job and on the road to some other kind of life. They would ultimately settle down with someone. But this kind of idea of the Lone Ranger is one that we hear a lot about and have seen often in American life. But it's not the one that's appropriate for the story I'm going to tell you today. Now, I'm a city guy. I live in Manhattan, and I trust that most of you are city kinds of people too. And so you probably can relate to this image even more than the first one. When you talk about being alone in America, it's hard not to think of the Edward Hopper painting Nighthawks, right? This 1942 image. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on in the image. I'll point out just a few of them. We've got our guy here whose back is towards us. He's obviously alone in this diner. We conventionally project a feeling of loneliness or something melancholy onto him. It's interesting, though. We don't see his face, so we don't really know what he's up to and how he's feeling. And that's interesting, this act of projection. And I want to suggest that it's something we do a lot when this issue is the one we're discussing. It's notable, too, that the people across from him are together, connected with each other. That looks like they've gone out on a date. They're dressed up a little bit. But if you share my reading of the painting, you might also think that they don't look like they're having the best evening. It's not clear that there's been a love connection there. Something has gone wrong. They're a little bit alone together, if you think about it. And what I think really kind of seals the deal here is that the diner they're in turns out to have no door, no windows that can open. It is a suffocating environment. They look to be trapped, and that gives you this feeling of anxiety, maybe looking at it. This is really what it means to be alone in a city. That's not the idea that I want to argue today either. It makes some sense, however, that people thought about living alone that way 60, 70 years ago. Because if you look closely at how we lived in 1950, a couple things pop out. The first is that almost every adult was married. Only 22% of American adults were single in 1950. And the other is that living alone was quite a rare experience. Fewer than 9% of all American households were one-person households in 1950. So in a way, it really was strange and peculiar. And that's why, in 1957, when a group of psychologists at the University of Michigan surveyed a nationally representative sample of American adults about their attitudes towards people who wanted to live alone, who wanted to be single, they found that 80% believed that single people who wanted to stay that way were sick, neurotic, or my favorite, immoral. Right? That's pretty strong views from a lot of people. Lest I stand before you as a sociologist, representing a purely enlightened position that's not so judgmental and that doesn't come to its work with some predispositions and a history of how to frame these experiences, let me tell you that the best-selling books in the history of American sociology are books that have titles like these. And maybe some of you recognize these books from your college syllabi. The Lonely Crowd, The Fall of Public Man, The Pursuit of Loneliness. These are books that sell hundreds of thousands, and in some cases, The Lonely Crowd, for instance, more than 1 million copies, and speak to some fundamental concern in American popular culture. These are older, more classic books. But if you followed recent debates about the state of civic life in the United States, or in the case of this second book here, Alone Together, our relationship to devices, you'll note a similar kind of theme, right? You probably remember the bowling alone idea. And if you look at the lonely roller on the cover of this book, this is Bob Putnam, the Harvard political scientist book, about the collapse and then revival of American community. You see this man looking a bit like he's come from an Edward Hopper painting into the bowling alley for a break. He's looking down at his ball, looks a little sad. And then there's Alone Together, which is this recent book by the MIT psychologist Sherry Turkle, in which she makes the argument that our passionate romantic involvement with our iPhones and Androids and other devices are supplanting our face-to-face relationships, so that we kind of we're attached to other things, to machines, but not so much to ourselves. We expect less from ourselves is the idea. And I want to suggest that the kind of root idea at the core of many of these books is an idea that goes something like this. Once upon a time, we lived in a golden age of strong communities, of more coherent relationships. Our marriages were stronger. Our friendships were tighter. Our children played in the streets. We all felt less lonely. Life was better. When we talk about our social lives, we often depict them as if that we're all involved in a fall from that glorious golden age. Now, it turns out an interesting thing is there's a kind of infinite regress here if you really read the literature. We almost always can find a golden age like 30 or 40 years before the moment we're writing. This is kind of the theme in the Woody Allen movie, right? Midnight in Paris, if you've seen it. But it's very much true in the way that we talk about American social life as well. We're prone to thinking that we've fallen from something better. Sometimes even the best scientific data seem to bear this out. I want to call your attention to a study that got an enormous amount of attention in 2006 when it came out. It was published in the top sociology journal. And the story it told is that between 1985 and 2004, the number of Americans who reported they had no confidant, no close friend, no one with whom they could discuss confidential and important matters skyrocketed. It went from about 1 in 10 people to 1 in 4. 1 in 4 American adults, we were told in this study, had no one with whom they could have those kinds of conversations. And this is a terrifying finding. It's a very scary idea about what it means to be American. Of course, the big thing that comes into our world between 1985 and 2004, is the internet and email and social media. So that raised a lot of concerns that maybe the stuff that you guys are up to here is destroying the fabric of American social life, and this is how it was reported out. Now, I've got this graph here on the side, not because it's such a gorgeous piece of design, but because it's from the USA Today. And I want to let you know that when the authors of this piece published it, they were invited onto every talk show, on the networks. They were featured in newspaper stories across the country. There was enormous amount of interest in this report. In some ways, it tells us a story we're used to hearing. It confirms that impression that things are worse than they used to be, that we are more disconnected than we used to be. Now, let me fully acknowledge that I, too, participated in this story at some level. My first book was a book about a heat wave disaster in Chicago in 1995. It was a crisis that lasted just a couple days, but more than 700 people died in Chicago. And what was really disturbing about the book and the event for many people is that huge numbers of people who died alone. And the book was seen to be a kind of expression or sign, a report on the way in which we had become disconnected and isolated. And I really focused in on the most vulnerable people who were living alone in Chicago, people who were very old and very frail, who were living in impoverished and bombed out, abandoned neighborhoods. It was a very sad and tough story. And when I finished the book, research foundation, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which does a lot of terrific health work, came to me and said, we'd really like to follow up with you and have you do more work on this issue of social isolation because we believe it's a serious problem and deserves more attention, so would you do it? And I said yes. I was interested in it. I knew that there was something here, and I fully expected that in this project I would follow the footsteps of those great social scientists before me and bring to you a report about the extent to which we have grown disconnected, fallen apart in America today, right? The amount of living alone is something staggering. I'll get to this in a second. And I thought I would have a book like this to share. So one of the great things about being a social scientist or a writer, and particularly one with tenure, is you get to be wrong. And you get to not lead with your conclusion. And if you lead with your conclusion, because sometimes we just do that, you have a chance to look at the facts and look at what you learn and move in a different direction. Now, it's hard to do that. It's hard to acknowledge that your predispositions took you to the wrong place, that an argument that you made to get the grant doesn't hold up. But in this case, I think it was merited. And so what I'm about to tell you is what I learned after deciding to write Alone in America with an Ed Hopper painting on the cover. The first thing I did was to scale up and out of Chicago, which is my hometown, and to try to look at this rise of living alone in some different way. There are two things here. Take in the top chart, but really I want to get your attention on the bottom for now because we'll go back to the top in just a moment. I realized when I looked at who lives alone in the United States that what I had seen in Chicago represented in some way the toe on the elephant. I had started looking at the oldest and most vulnerable of people who lived alone, and I was ready to generalize about them. But if you look closely at the numbers, you see something quite remarkable. There are about 32.7 million Americans who live alone today. Of those, about 11 million are over the age of 65. It's not at all kind of generalized from what I saw. And I hesitate to even call that 11 million elderly, because the truth is a great proportion of them are between 65 and 75 or 80, and the point is that they're much more healthy, more alive, more active and engaged than the people we used to call elderly. And if they were in the room here, they would object to me saying the name elderly. So aging has changed. So a part of the story here is people are aging and aging alone, but remaining healthier and more active. But the really big thing that impressed me when I looked at that bar chart below is that, contrary to what I thought going in, the majority of Americans who live alone are adults between the ages of 35 and 65. They have been married before, they have lived with someone before, and they're now living alone for some considerable portion of their lives. You can see the gender skew, and I want to get back to that. There are more women living alone than men, about 18 million plus compared to 14 million plus for men. But you'll see how it skews. So the women are living alone in their later years, whereas men are actually more likely to live alone under the age of 50. That's the other thing that I want to call your attention to. It turns out that in recent decades, the fastest growing group of people living alone are young adults, under 35. Consider this. In 1950, about 1% of young adults were living alone. Today, it's about 11%. 500,000 in 1950, more than 5 million today. Now, obviously, you're thinking, these last few years have been terrible for the economy. You know, we're reading all about the boomerang generation, right? Young people who can't launch themselves fully away from their parents. They boomerang back and land right in the basement, if not in their old childhood room, because the labor market is so bad. That's true. It turns out there are more young people who are moving back with their parents. But the dip in living alone has been incredibly small. 12% of young adults lived alone in 2007 compared to 11% today. Right? What's staggering, in a way, is how little that has changed. And something I think we should track and pay more attention to. Here's the other thing, to add another set of bars to the bar chart I showed you before. Remember how 22% of American adults were single in 1950? Today it's about 49%. Almost 1 in 2 American adults is unmarried. And the proportion of one-person households has gone from 9% nationally to 28% nationally in just 50 years. Now, I know you want to see this in different ways, so we'll quickly go through here. The rise in population of Americans living alone from 5 or 6 million in 1960, 4 million in 1950, to 33 million today, roughly. Here it is in proportional terms, because you're not going to be persuaded by just the absolute numbers, right? You know there are more people, so there should be more, but proportionally it's a big change too. I should note a very steep increase between 2000 and 2012, and in fact, considerable increase between 2008 and 2012. So the recession did not slow down the proportion of Americans living alone either. I told you that in 1950 this was a more rural phenomenon about migrant workers. Today, of course, it's primarily an urban one. What you're looking at here is a map of the proportion of households in different cities that are one-person households. Here we are in Seattle, where 42% of households have just one person. And there's some cities here where you would expect to see big numbers, like Seattle or Miami maybe, or Boston. Okay? But look at Denver and Minneapolis and Atlanta and Cleveland and Chicago. You know, a bunch of cities where the proportion of one-person households is very high, right? Over 40% in all those cities except for Chicago. In Washington, D.C. and in Manhattan, where I live, it's almost 1 in 2 households are one-person households. And of course, there's a way in which that understates the concentration of living alone, because solo livers are not equally distributed in all urban neighborhoods, right? There are specific places where they come to live alone but be together, like Belltown in Seattle, for instance. And there are neighborhoods like that throughout the United States. I'm willing to bet you could name them from your seats here. The bulk of my book is going beyond the numbers. I've shown you those numbers there because they're impressive, and I think they begin to tell us a story about a social change that we hadn't recognized before. But we can get into trouble if we too quickly make interpretations based on numbers without really knowing what's inside of them. And so the bulk of the research for this book came from interviews. I assembled a research team, and we scoured through different cities, the East Coast, the West Coast, and Texas and Chicago, a little bit outside of the United States as well, to look at the lives of people who live alone and try to understand what they were doing. We separated them roughly into 3 different groups. I've given you them. above the age of 65, between 35 and 65, and under 35. There are different kinds of experiences. We also talked to some very poor men who are living alone in hotel residences in New York City. But it turns out there are not a lot of people who are impoverished and live alone for obvious reasons. It's expensive to live alone, right? So you find it in affluent places and middle-class places, but far less in poor ones. For me, the big breakthrough came in learning to recognize that the social problems language that we typically use to describe what's happened in our lives, the kind of golden age fallen story, is wholly inadequate for making sense of the rise of living alone. There are social problems related to living alone. I know that from the book I wrote about the heat wave, and I'll tell you about some of them today. In some cases, living alone can lead to loneliness and isolation and worse. But really, that doesn't capture the majority of the experience. And I came to think that we're much better off understanding this. We have much better analytic capacity to understand this if we think of it as a social experiment, not just a social problem. And there's a reason for this. Until the 1950s, you could not find a single society in all of human history that sustained large numbers of people living alone for long periods of time. Not a single one. In 1949, the great anthropologist George Murdoch wrote a book called Social Structure, in which he surveyed everything we knew about family formation and the life course in an enormous sample of cultures. And his conclusion, which proved to be controversial, was that the nuclear family is a universal human social grouping. Now, the conclusion was controversial because some people said he had failed to recognize alternative collectives. So there was a game in anthropology and history of like trying to come up with the societies where it wasn't just a conventional nuclear family, but there were more people living together, like the kibbutz, for instance. No one said you missed out on the fact that there are all these societies organized around one-person dwellings because they didn't exist. What that tells me is that we have about 200,000 years of history as a species learning how to live together in groups, and about 50 or 60 years learning how to live alone. This is truly a novel way to organize our lives and our settlements. For me, it's like the equivalent of being an anthropologist landing on an island that no one has discovered before, except for that the thing was right in front of us all along. So naturally, you probably want to know a little bit about how this happened and what it means. And I'd like to talk about that a little bit with you today, too. If you speak with economists, they'll tell you, look, there are two simple reasons that so many people are living alone in the world today. And they boil down to one reason, which is that people can afford to do it. We live alone because we can. Two big reasons, the economists say. The first is, in the second part of the 20th century, market economies generated enough widespread affluence that more people could afford to get places of their own just based on the wealth that they were producing for themselves. And the second thing is the rise of welfare states. They provided people a safety net, a kind of social security and human security that made it possible to feel okay while living alone, right? To not necessarily need other people. That's a pretty powerful argument and gets at a lot of what's going on. But I want to suggest that it's not wholly satisfying for a couple of reasons. First of all, you can find societies where there's a lot of affluence, but very little living alone. For instance, Saudi Arabia, very wealthy. Basically, nobody lives alone there. And we'll get to the reason why. I'm guessing you've already figured it out. But another reason is that there are lots of things that we can afford to do and choose not to do. Right? We don't choose to do all the things that we have the resources to do. So I found that it was productive to reframe the question this way. Right? Of all the ways we could use our money and our security, why do it to get places of our own? Now, let me acknowledge something here. It's a little peculiar. If I were speaking to a group of sociologists at this point, you might be ready to throw stones and bottles at me, because I'm invoking a concept which I haven't named yet, and the concept is choice. Now, we live in a world where there's an intellectual division of labor, And most of the time, the economists get choice and the sociologists get constraint. Right? They tell us what we opt into. We tell you why you can't do what you want to do, which is, I think, one of the big reasons why there are not so many people taking our courses anymore. I think you can't understand the rise of living alone outside the language of choice. Of the hundreds of people we interviewed, the truth is the majority said that in the abstract they'd like to be living with the right partner. People aren't saying, my aspiration is to have a place of my own. That's what I hope for myself forever. Some do, but they're not the majority. But the thing that's interesting is, today, we are unwilling to settle for the wrong person. We won't live with the person we don't want to live with. Moreover, unlike 50 years ago or 100 years ago, we are not interested in much less expensive options for how to live if we don't have a romantic partner we want to be with. For instance, we don't want to move in with our parents if we can help it. If we're older, we don't want to move in with our children if we can help it. We want to move in with roommates when we leave school and move into a big city, and we enjoy living with roommates until we don't. And we often have that experience, so much so that we're not interested in Craigslist, thank you very much, when we can afford it. So we are not just choosing to live alone, we're paying a premium to do it because it's more expensive. And it's hard to discount that. Why do we make this choice? Well, if you think about it, living alone comports with sacred modern values. It gives us freedom, not simply freedom from, but freedom to do what we want, when we want to do it, without concern about someone's judging eyes looking over us, right? Living alone can give us a degree of control over our personal lives that it can be difficult to get otherwise. It can give us a chance to have a kind of self-realization. It gives us solitude, right? A break from the busy social lives we have, from the constant attention that we spend and give to our media, our social media, our work life. Paradoxically, I came to appreciate that living alone can give us a chance to reconnect, not just with ourselves, but also with other people, and to reconnect in ways that are meaningful, in relationships that have some depth. And it's interesting. I should tell you, in case it's not obvious, my book is not the case for living alone. It's not the case against marriage. I'm not trying to persuade you to leave work today and abandon your spouse. I'm not interested in that. I personally am married. I have 2 young children. My wife likes to say sometimes that this is my fantasy book. But, the truth is, I think we all need a chance to have some of these things. We all value these things. In the mornings, I drop off my children at school, and now that the parents in my kids' schools know that I've written this book, they all come to me with their secret confessions about how much they long for solitude, right? That, there's nothing that makes you appreciate freedom and personal control and solitude more than living in a small Manhattan apartment with your family. So we all need some of these things. Living alone is one way to get it. But that's not the whole story, right? I want to say that there's some other big drivers in the rise of living alone, and I want to run through them with you. Now, the first is this woman here. Maybe you recognize her. My students don't. We're getting older, folks. What can I say? It beats the alternative. Mary Tyler Moore. Why is she there? Because you cannot understand the rise of living alone outside of the rising status of women in the world. When women achieve economic independence, they develop the means to delay marriage and also to get out of a marriage that doesn't work. Right? Today, we get married later than ever in recorded history. The average age of first marriage is about 29 for men and about 27 for women in the United States. In cities like Seattle, it's over 30. Okay? And if you combine the kind of economic independence of women with their sexual independence and the cultural independence that comes from changes that gave them the capacity to control their bodies and their lives, this represents a real sea change in what it means to live. Just 60 years ago, women who got divorced were doomed to a life of poverty and struggle, or were sentenced to move back in with their family members. Right? We oftentimes forget this change. That, of course, is no longer necessary today. It's not easy to make ends meet after a divorce, we know, but women can do it, and that's a new thing. Remember Saudi Arabia? That's why no one lives alone in Saudi Arabia. Women don't have the economic independence to do it, don't have the cultural independence to do it. I would be remiss to be here in Redmond speaking to you at Microsoft without saying that the communications revolution is an enormous driver in the rise of living alone. The thing is that the communications revolution that really mattered, at least at first, was the introduction of the home telephone and the television, and to some extent the radio. Why? Because with these communication technologies, we gain the capacity to be home alone, but also connected to other people and to ideas and to entertainment in ways that previously were impossible. Right? That really establishes a change in what it means to be home and alone. Now, if you fast forward to today, to a world in which we have social media that are enabled by the internet, Skype, right? If you're a grandparent, you're living alone, and you've got children or grandchildren in another part of the country, or Facebook, right? Or Craigslist, or Meetup, or instant messaging, or email, or Netflix, or massively multiplayer video games, right? You name it. People who live alone today can experience a rich and profound social life when they're home. I think that we often overestimate the ways in which social media are pulling us apart from each other, and fail to appreciate that social media are actually quite social. So for instance, the alone together thesis, that we rely more on our devices than we do on each other. I'm sympathetic to many of the concerns behind the book. I get worried about children who spend too much time in front of screens and don't give their neural pathways a chance to develop optimally. That's an issue that we all should be paying attention to, right? I get worried about the truck driver, and particularly my driver in the taxi, who's texting while he's racing up Fifth Avenue. Right? This is not a situation you want to be in. I read the stories about kids who are in their devices walking across the streets. There are lots of terrible and dangerous things here. But to my knowledge, and maybe you have better, the best research we have so far tells us that the heaviest users of the internet and social media and cell phones, smartphones, are more likely than others to spend time with other people face to face. They're more likely than others to go out into public places where they encounter strangers. This is the finding of the Pew Internet study done by Keith Hampton when he was at the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. And I haven't seen any better evidence showing me that this is wrong. Right? Talk to older people about the ways in which they are using social media, and you gain an appreciation for the way in which it's transformed the experience of being home alone. So with communications today, it need not be solitary or isolating. Very quickly now, there are a couple other drivers that are worth paying attention to. One is urbanization, and I've already showed you the map, letting you see what a powerful change this has been, and told you that we can locate the neighborhoods where people live alone and come to live alone alongside other people. The truth is that single people are more likely than people who are married to be social. They're more likely to spend time with friends and with neighbors than people who are married. They're more likely to go out at night in bars and restaurants and cafes and spend money. They're more likely to come to public lectures and to take art classes and to do a number of the things that we really value in cities. So there's this nice synergistic virtuous circle that you find. Cities, singles. There's subcultures of singles in cities everywhere today. This is a fundamentally new thing in the world. And finally, I'd be remiss to not say that you can't understand the rise of living alone outside of the rise of aging alone. The longevity revolution has changed the experience of being alive. It means that today because we live longer, but not always equally long to our partner. There are a growing number of people who outlive their spouses by 5 or 10 or 20 or 30 years. Typically, these people are women, right? And you saw the chart before. That's why women are so much more likely than men to live alone. It's because they're more likely than men to age alone. Now, here's the thing. Women who live alone at all stages of the life course are more likely than men to stay connected to their friends and their family members. Women do a better job of making and maintaining relationships than men from the beginning of their adult years on till the end. So while women are more likely to age alone, they are less likely to get isolated. Men, when they get isolated, when they live alone, if they divorce their spouse, the spouse on whom they likely relied for a lot of care and social work, if they outlive their spouse, they're at greater risk of getting isolated. And that's a serious thing, something that we could pay attention to. One of the things I'm really interested in is the way in which new communications technologies are giving men new skills for being connected, for making friendships, for maintaining relationships, for getting themselves out in the world. I think we haven't studied that enough, and there's really something to do there. It might be possible that the rising generation of men are going to develop some skills for being connected that the current generation of older men don't have. But that's an open question, maybe something we could discuss. For these older men, and even for younger men who wind up living alone, the Edward Hopper world of isolation, that melancholy place of being alone in a city, becomes more relevant. And it's something I'm concerned about. There are policy issues here that come up. There's no quick and easy solutions for them, but when we slash our budgets for urban services, for things like Meals on Wheels or home care or specialized public transportation during a tough economic time, those are the programs that get cut. Those are the people who suffer, and they're not on our radar screen in the way that they could be. But we are seeing these interesting kinds of adaptations. In just the last decade, the number of older people who've learned skills to use social media, who've become more comfortable with interacting through screens, is striking. And I think there's a lot of room to develop programs here as well. Issues about access to the communications, issues about media literacy, issues about how you design the devices to make them more user-friendly to older people are clearly important. And I think there's a lot of exciting action in this area. And I say this as someone whose children spend a lot of time communicating with their grandparents on devices. So although I'm concerned that some people do get isolated and find it difficult, the story in the end of the book is that going solo turns out to be a much more social experience than we conventionally think it is, a more connected experience than we think it is. Let's not be glib about it. People who live alone feel lonely and complain that it can be difficult to be as connected as they want to be. But they say something very interesting here, particularly the people who live alone after having been married or lived with a partner for some time. In the hundreds of interviews I did, one recurrent theme that was hard for me to dismiss was this one. People who have lived in relationships that don't work will tell you that there's nothing more lonely than being next to a person and still feeling isolated. It's a very powerful idea that recurred in our conversations. And they said, moreover, when you're living alone and you feel loneliness, that's a kind of physiological cue, an emotional cue, that you should do something, get out in the world, connect with other people, get active. It's pretty clear what that cue is. Some people get locked in a kind of vicious circle and have trouble doing it. Loneliness leads to depression, but they're a real minority, and they can get help. When you're married to someone, and they're right beside you, and you feel that loneliness and isolation, it's a very profound and disturbing, emotional signal. And it's not exactly clear what the cue for behavior is. Right? So we shouldn't think that loneliness is something that belongs to solos and not to the rest of us. It's a false comparison. The science on this is oftentimes shoddy. When we talk about the health benefits of marriage, for instance, or the risks of being alone. Remember that study I told you about? 1 in 4 Americans have no confidants, no close friends, the one that was all over the news? So it turns out that when that study was published, a number of us who really know the literature on social networks said, this just seems funny. It's so out of sync with everything we know about American social patterns. Are you sure it's right? And guess what? It wasn't. The data were flawed, deeply flawed. And there's some signs that the authors even knew this before publication. I wrote about it in the book, and the Chronicle of Higher Education decided to do some follow-up. They called the person who is now a professor at Cornell. At the time, he was the grad student who did most of the number crunching, and asked him about the data. And he said, well, I certainly don't think it's reliable. And it isn't. But let me tell you something. That story did not make the Today Show and the cover of the USA Today and the New York Times and talk shows throughout the country. Right? When the story is, we're just about as social as we always have been, we're just about as lonely as we always have been, that's not a great news story, right? But it's true. So let me end by saying, I think we need to hit the refresh button and find some new images to capture this experience of what it means to go solo. We have the Hopper part of it down. We know the melancholy story. We've heard that. There's another way to show it. Our lives, I've come to believe, are more interesting than we think. They're more interesting than we say. Our social lives are more interesting than we say. It's like we live our lives and have some level of satisfaction. We struggle with some things, but we're doing okay. And then when it comes to talk about the way the world is, we suddenly get into this kind of crisis mode, like we're on Fox News kind of saying the world is ending. I don't know why we do that. I don't know what that's about. But we need to appreciate the kind of productive side of our social lives as well as the dangerous and disconnected one. Remember I told you that book concept originally, Alone in America? I've told you why the alone part is wrong, right? Turns out the America part is wrong too. I really thought this was a story about our rugged individualism, our religion of self-reliance, the stuff we've inherited from Emerson and Thoreau and the Lone Ranger and the whole tradition. But it turns out that we are laggards when it comes to living alone, not leaders. The places on earth where living alone is most common are the Scandinavian societies, where they have invested collectively in programs that support one another. They have subsidized housing. They have guaranteed access to health care and to home care and to transportation. They have gun control. They have safeguarded the streets so that you can live alone and be connected to a world of people who are there for you. Living alone is more common in family-centric Japan than it is in the United States. What I came to conclude is that our independence is made possible by our interdependence. It's by collectively investing in each other, finding ways to support and be with each other, that we make it possible for people to live alone without being disconnected, without being miserable, without being isolated in all the ways that we fear. How could we not think of this as a social achievement of some kind? I hope that now you understand the title a little bit better and appreciate the birds. You know, we had to jump a species to get the image right this time around, but maybe, not long from now, we'll have an image of an actual human being alone, and we won't think all the things that we usually think about it. Thank you very much.
Yes? I have sort of two questions. I'll start with the easier one first.
Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about the transition period for folks that are going from, you say predominantly your studies deal with people that weren't alone first, and then they come into a life on their own.
Yeah.
The transition period for those folks. And in Embracing, you had a slide that talked about basically the 5 higher values, the self-actualization pieces that come from what people get from having that experience, but how long it takes to embrace those things and become comfortable with them.
So it depends. One of the things I write about in the book is the history of the private room for a child and the history of the crib. Right? So we all grow up in some collective environment. There are not many people who just raise themselves in places of their own. So we don't have a real model that we've lived inside of for how to go solo. And there's not really a roadmap for it. There's not a how-to guide that's out there. So there's a lot of learning that has to happen. And the people I spoke with talked about that learning process and some of the challenges that they had to overcome. How to make sure that you're using your time home alone to have that productive solitude that gives you a chance for self-realization and for reconnecting. Right? If you live alone at home and you go home and you pop open a bottle of whiskey and get on the couch and start watching, bad sitcoms, it's not going to be a healthy experience for you, right? So people struggle with that. How do you learn the skills to cook, for one? These things are not easy to do. People talk about getting a place of their own, being really excited, and then waiting for the phone to ring or for someone to knock on the door like they did in college, and then realizing that doesn't happen. You have to be a self-starter. You have to project yourself out in the world. Those are skills. But interestingly, when it comes to this kind of history about the private room, in the last 50 or 60 years, we have been involved in this other experiment, which is that middle-class people in the United States and Europe and the kind of developed economies that are on that list I gave you before, that bar chart at the end, have had the experience of growing up in rooms of their own. They also had the experience of sleeping in a crib as infants, which that we didn't do just, 100 years ago. Very unusual to sleep in a crib. People slept with their parents, right? Their mothers in particular, in a bed. So there's a way in which this individuation process happens at an earlier phase than before. In 1950, there were more people than bedrooms in the typical American home. Today, there's slightly more bedrooms than people in the typical American home. And housing units in Europe have the same change. So what do you think it is that college students demand when they get to campus their freshman year and every year thereafter? If you're in charge of the housing office, what do you hear about? Yeah, people want a single. Everybody wants a single. And so there's a way in which we are prepared for it. Now, you could go different places with that. You could say, oh, it's all narcissism, we don't know how to get along anymore. But you might also think that people might be better equipped for the experience of being alone that has become so common. The real difficulties come for people who are 50, 60, 70, have never lived alone, and suddenly find themselves divorced or a widow or a widower and now have to remake their lives, and they've never had this experience before. I think that future generations will be better at it. Now, I know that was your easy question.
So can you actually go back a slide?
Okay.
Because you touched on this a little bit in your explanation. So I look at this and you talk about changing the images overall about what it means to be alone. And I see that we have a lot of other parts of the world that are further ahead of us. And I wonder how much it ties into the big polarization that goes into discussion nowadays between sort of liberalism and conservatism. And there's a big push behind conservative values and preserving the nuclear family and the family unit. And a lot of the things that come into tearing that down are demonized. And then it sort of tends to lead towards more of these negative pictures about what it means to have more of the individual-based society where people can live on their own.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how we tie back in the broader argument that's going in with that to supporting the notion that it's actually okay and there's social progress. Obviously, there's other countries here that I feel are more socially progressive than us, and they're doing well with this concept, and they're further along.
The politics of this are tricky, right? I mean, the libertarians and the conservatives who don't like welfare states, they like freedom. Right? They like individualism. And so it's the paradox that it's by collectively investing in each other that we give people the freedom to live the way they want to live. Now, there are different strains of conservatism, of course, and there is a kind of branch of politics today that's interested in a different kind of conservatism. They want to bring us back into an age when, say, women didn't have the same level of control over their lives and bodies as they have today. I think, you hear some of the candidates, talking about rolling back reproductive rights, for instance, and you think this is this is like moving us back closer to the Saudi Arabia side than towards the Sweden side of the continuum. And I find that somewhat worrisome. I think one thing to note here is that living alone tends to go up when people can afford it, when people have the human security to do it. And they can afford it because of the market, or they can afford it because of the welfare state. So in recent years, the countries that have had, among the countries that have had the fastest increases in living alone are China and India and Brazil, right? Places where there's a lot of market activity. But I wonder what will happen to living alone in Scandinavia if they really roll back the welfare state programs, if they get rid of the subsidized housing. If in the United States we roll back Social Security or privatize it and things fall apart, older people will not be able to live alone. And it's interesting, we worry about older people who live alone and worry about them getting isolated, and I think with good reason. But you talk to older people who live alone and they will tell you that their dignity and sense of integrity rests on it. That if they get to the point in their lives when they can no longer go solo, when they have to move in with their children or with friends or into some kind of institutional facility, that will represent to them some terrible loss. It will represent to them the end of something about their life. And so we, in fact, invest heavily as families to help our relatives live alone as long as they possibly can. And I write a little bit about assisted living facilities, for instance, which can be impossibly expensive, for all but the most affluent people. So the book ends with a section on redesigning solo life, in which I try to take up some of these questions. How could we design better buildings, communication systems, artificial intelligence, neighborhoods, to make living alone a more connected experience? Yeah.
The lady in the picture, I forget her name, Mary Taylor or someone, looked pretty glad to be there.
Mary Tyler Moore, yeah.
But of all the things you listed, the sacred modern virtues, the going out to socialize, the being in accord with choice, the one that you didn't list was happiness. And I was struck that your graph, which showed the steady increase since 1950 of living alone, was also the exact inverse of happiness since 1950. And I'm wondering if...
Oh, I don't know that literature. So if you look at happiness since 1950, we started off really happy in 1950, and the studies using the same methodologies, the same questions, show a steady decline in happiness. Is that what you're saying? Oh, I don't know that. I got to say, I'm a little suspicious, but I should see it. The studies that I have seen on happiness tend to look something like this. People who are in happy marriages are at the happy end of the distribution. Then there's people who are in, by happy I just mean successful, right? Because if you are in an unsuccessful, unhappy marriage, you have a pretty easy exit option these days to get divorced. Then kind of right below them on the spectrum, just a little bit, but noticeably below, significantly below, are people who've never married. And then at the bottom part of the happiness spectrum are people who were married and then divorced, or married and then widowed. Some of the literature on the happiness stuff actually throws out the people who are married and then divorced, or married and then widowed, and it's just a study. There's studies of the entire universe of people who are successfully married, and the entire universe of people who are the entire universe of people who are single. And I've always found this to be complicated for the methodological problem I just gave you, which is they throw out the people for whom the drug didn't work. You know what I mean? Like if I give you the marriage drug and it works for you, then you stay in the study. But if I give you the marriage drug and you reject it, or you refuse to take it, or you die, then you're out of the study. And so the comparisons are really, really weird.
So then you should be able to control for that and look at clear cases like people who are living with housemates versus living alone after you adjust for income levels. I wonder if you observed any difference.
Yeah, so I can't answer you with the best data on that. But I would love to see, I'll give you my email address, I would love to see the happiness studies showing that steady decline from 1950, because that would be a useful thing to know. I find myself skeptical of it. And what I know, for instance, about there are studies of loneliness levels, and we do not see by any means the spikes of loneliness that work along with that spike in living alone. So living alone and being lonely seem to be detached. They're different kinds of things. And gosh, I really want to see the happiness stuff. So we'll continue the conversation. Happiness is one of those things that's tough to measure. You really have to know what you mean by it. And well, another discussion. Yes?
So you talk about how single people are more likely to go out and seek, like social interactions, go out to bars.
People who live alone, yeah.
Yeah. People who live alone. Okay. So, and I mean, sort of anecdotally, I'm sure everybody knows like the married couple or the couple who like, gets together and then doesn't go out as much and doesn't hang out as much. But do you have any like studies or any information about like married people or people who are partnered up who do like manage to go out and still be very sociable, and like what that takes for partners to be able to affect the same sort of like reaching out socially?
Yeah. So what I was giving you that were not anecdotes, just to be clear. The social surveys that look at how we spend our time tell us that people in marriages are less likely than people who live alone to spend time with friends and with neighbors, and they're less likely to volunteer in civic organizations. They're less likely to go out to these public places and spend time and money. That probably comports with a lot of our personal observations and experiences. It turns out that women who are married are the most affected by the marriage. There's a sociologist named Naomi Gerstel who writes about the greedy marriage, and said, marriages, especially when they're children, are very demanding on women's time. You're probably not going to believe this, but it turns out that women tend to do the majority of the domestic work in American families. I did it right. Definitely not in my personal case. I want to be clear. Yeah. I make that argument almost every night. But it turns out that that's a trend. And so women find themselves, without the time and the energy that it takes to go be out in the world, whether it's volunteering or out with their friends or doing other things. So that's a pretty robust finding, and that doesn't mean that married people can't get out in the world and find ways to do it. Part of what I'm pushing for here, I hope you hear this, is a kind of a more honest conversation about how we live and what we value and what we aspire to, because it seems to me that we have a story we tell ourselves about how we should be organizing our lives, which runs in real contrast to this kind of the way in which we actually do things. And the result of it is we're always feeling bad about ourselves, because it's like we're not living up to this ideal from some other time when it probably wasn't idealized as much as we think it is. So where I'm pushing us here is to be more appreciative and realistic about our social lives and our ideals and our values, so that we can kind of live more rich lives, so that we can say to our partner, I love being married to you and sharing a home with you, and I think I might be a healthier person if I have some more opportunity for solitude or for going out in the world. I miss these things that I used to have before. Maybe we can have maybe we can figure out a way that we can have time with each other, but also give each other freedom to do this other thing. I actually think that when you talk to people in successful relationships, they often have stories about how they do that, precisely that. But that doesn't get reflected in these conversations about the end of the family and the end of the marriage and this other stuff. So if we had more realistic expectations about what we should expect from relationships, we wouldn't find ourselves so disappointed by what we get. Okay, thank you very much.